Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime.
A listener's note. The following episode contains coarse language, adult themes, and content of a violent and disturbing nature, and may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
During the Second World War, 1.1 million Canadian men and women served in the Canadian Army, Royal Canadian Navy, and Royal Canadian Air Force. That's 10% of the population. 42,000 of those never came home. The war even reached our shores, as German U-boats patrolled the waters, looking to strike at the great Atlantic convoys. But nowhere was the war closer than in Halifax. Men and women left for Europe or came home, changed from what they saw. And then after 6 long years of war, the conflict ended when Germany surrendered. From the smallest town to the biggest city, everybody cheered. But nowhere was the end of the war in Europe celebrated like in Halifax. And for that, a bit of math. Take 9,000 soldiers, add in 61,000 liters of hard liquor, 15,000 cases of wine, 8,000 cases of beer, and what do you get? You get one massive and very destructive party. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today we are cracking open a few cold ones and letting loose on the dance floor as I share the story of the Halifax Riot. Since its founding in the mid-18th century, Halifax has always become important during wartime. The American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, even the Boer War were all a boon for the city as a major British Empire port. During the First World War, Halifax played a major role as troops and supplies left North America from its harbor in huge convoys destined for the war in Europe. That same harbor welcomed home soldiers who had spent months or even years in the meat grinder of the Western Front. On December 6, 1917, all that war activity led to the Halifax explosion, the largest man-made explosion in history until the birth of the nuclear era. I talked about this terrible event that killed 2,000 people in an episode earlier in 2024. Reconstruction efforts that followed the Halifax explosion helped the local economy somewhat, but a huge decline in worldwide shipping following the war brought difficult times for many in the city, and the economy fell into a heavy slump. When the Great Depression began in 1929, the city's economy fell further. But as it had so often been the case, a new war was on the horizon, and Halifax went from bust to boom once more. In September 1939, the Second World War began, and Halifax became a major port for the Allies. The city was a vital link during the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Atlantic. Supplies flowed out to help the British withstand the Blitz and a potential amphibious invasion by the Germans. One British admiral went so far as to call Halifax the most important port in the world.
Food, armaments, and every kind of war material to cross the Atlantic. Another great mass of vital equipment to sail the seas and help to build up our smashing offensive against the Axis. In an eastern Canadian port, the crews at this time of year must fight the weather conditions as well as submarines and raiding bombers. It's a side of our worldwide battle that is being fought grimly and relentlessly, day and night without pause or rest.
From 1939 to 1945, the population of the city increased by 60%, but the infrastructure and city's facilities did not keep up with the pace. At every level, the number of soldiers in the city created issues. Going out for dinner meant standing in a long line just to get into the door, and movie theaters didn't fare much better. Standing in line for hours to see a movie was pretty usual during the war years. Things were even worse when it came to grocery shopping. Wartime rationing had already made many items difficult to find. Beginning in 1942, sugar, coffee, tea, butter, and meat were all rationed, and even food served in restaurants and cafeteria was rationed and diverted from grocery stores to feed thousands of hungry pilots, sailors, and soldiers stationed within the city and surrounding areas. Often, Halifax residents would find empty shelves when they went to the grocery store, and if you wanted to drown your sorrows in a glass of beer, you were out of luck. To prevent profiteering during the war, the government of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King shortened the hours of operation for beer parlors and liquor stores and prohibited all alcohol advertising. They also reduced the alcohol content of beer by 10%, wine by 20%, and spirits by 30%. Most of that watered-down beer went to the men and women in service who spent their off hours in Halifax, enjoying life, knowing that they could ship out at any moment. This created resentment between residents and soldiers as the city burst at the seams. Soldiers felt residents were taking advantage of them with high prices on everything from rent to food, and that anger was not unfounded. A housing shortage caused rents to increase exponentially and remain that way throughout the war. Finding a place to stay was nearly impossible, and encampments popped up in parks across Halifax, but everyone kept it together through the war. They knew there was a greater issue to deal with than the inconveniences of daily life. Tensions didn't go away though, they just simmered under the surface. Every day, animosity grew like a pot of water on low until one day it reached the boiling point. Halifax was a city ready to boil over. There was so much concern over the simmering tensions that, as the end of the war approached in the spring of 1945, city organizers planned to stop all tram service to prevent sailors from getting into downtown Halifax to celebrate. Even liquor stores, restaurants, and retailers closed their doors for a few days when the war finally ended. The mentality was that if everything was closed, troops would remain at bases and ships. But, in the words of Dr. Ian Malcolm, life finds a way. If someone wants to party, they're going to make it happen. And the powder keg of Halifax was ready to blow, and all it needed was a match, and that match's name was Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray. Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray was one of the most respected men in Canada during the Second World War. Born in Nova Scotia in 1896, he was drawn to the ocean from a very early age. When Murray was 14 in 1910, he joined the first 21 recruits into the Royal Naval College of Canada in Halifax. The college was created the same year, and Murray described his first winter there as hell. Measles broke out among the recruits, and there was no proper uniforms to help keep them warm from the cold. 3 years later, he graduated from the college and joined the naval service on the British HMS Berwick. And when the First World War began, Murray was stationed aboard Canada's first naval ship, HMCS Niobe. Later, he was assigned to Canada's second ship, HMCS Rainbow. Over the course of the First World War, he served on 3 of Canada's 6 Royal Canadian Navy ships. When peace finally arrived, he remained with the Royal Canadian Navy and worked his way up the ranks. He eventually became the commander of a Canadian destroyer and went on to serve as commander of Canadian naval bases on both coasts. As soon as the Second World War began, Murray was appointed as the Deputy Chief of Naval Staff and was instrumental in the rapid growth of the Royal Canadian Navy from just 6 ships in 1939 to over 330 by 1945. As amazing as it sounds, for a brief period, Canada had one of the largest navies on the planet. Due to his experience, he was also given command of a fleet of 5 Canadian ships which were sent to the United Kingdom to help defend the country during the Battle of Britain. Murray was later assigned to the east coast of Canada, eventually rising to the rank of Commander-in-Chief, Canadian Northwest Atlantic. And in that capacity, he helped lead the Allied forces to victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. And Murray was so respected that he received the honor of giving Prime Minister Winston Churchill a personal tour of Halifax on September 14, 1943. That same year, Murray was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire. He was admired. His record was excellent, but one event would tarnish everything. Following the suicide of Adolf Hitler on April 30th, 1945, it was only a matter of time before Germany surrendered to the Allies. That happened at 2:41 a.m. on May 7th.
The business we Canadians came over here to do is virtually finished. The military might of Hitler's Germany is a horror of the past. And in this prolonged and bitter struggle, now crowned with victory, the Army of Canada has played a sterling part. Canadians are entitled to be very proud of their soldiers, I am certainly proud beyond words to count myself one of them. We have reached the time when the great and gallant company which has formed the 1st Canadian Army is about to dissolve. By groups and by units, with anticipation and joy in their hearts, tempered by the memories of the friends they have lost, the Canadians who have survived will be returning home to Canada. I believe that the future of Canada rests in their hands.
Across the Western world, people erupted in celebrations at the news that the Second World War had finally ended. By the afternoon of May 7th, people filled the streets of every major Canadian city. In Toronto, Bay Street was crowded with people. Schools let out early and confetti rained down on the city streets, grinding traffic to a halt. The Toronto Star reported, "Front and rear bumpers along the running boards of cars are packed with flag-waving kids cheering and singing. It is possible to wade up to your knees in wrapping paper, ticker tape, and such on the east end of Yonge near King." In Ottawa, a similar scene as thousands of people poured onto the street and paper was thrown from nearby office buildings. In Vancouver, thousands of people cheered and sang to celebrate the end of the war. The sky was described as a snowstorm of paper, and the entire city took the day off to make the most of it. And across the country on the East Coast, Halifax was getting ready to celebrate, and it would be a party the city would never forget. War wasn't the only worry for Halifax. Well before it ended, citizens warned Mayor Alan Butler in 1944 that extra protection would be needed to protect the city from partying soldiers. The mayor didn't take action, but Police Chief Judson Conrad did. He began preparing for the day the war ended and communicated with the armed services in the city about their intentions. He also recommended that the day be declared a holiday so businesses could close. And 1 month later, that day finally came, and whistles blew around Halifax to announce the end of the war. Sales clerks closed their doors, servers walked out of restaurants, and before long, the citizens of Halifax were celebrating in the streets. And while it was a rambunctious celebration, there was no violence, nor looting or vandalism. But all of that was about to change. In the words of the Beastie Boys, you gotta fight for your right to party. And the army was about to invade the city. As VE Day celebrations continued, the men and women of Canada's Army, Air Force, and Navy felt relieved to be at the end of one of the most difficult times of their lives. Many had faced death while others saw friends die. Every moment was stalked by death, which could be around the next corner. Then, in an instant, that fear was gone, and as the tension was released, soldiers were ready to party. The Royal Canadian Air Force and Canadian Army put in strict schedules and rules of conduct for their personnel to prevent them from getting out of hand. Instead of allowing men to go into the city, they provided them with planned activities within the garrisons so they could celebrate, but in a supervised and contained way. The Royal Canadian Navy went a different route. Rear Admiral Leonard W. Murray believed that his sailors had proven themselves during the war and should be allowed to celebrate the end of 6 very long years. His senior officers advised him that he should limit sailors, but Murray wanted his men to enjoy themselves. Murray told them they could go ashore to Halifax, but added that they should, quote, be joyful without being destructive or distasteful. To say the sailors didn't heed his advice would be an understatement. The wet canteen of HMCS Stadacona, docked in Halifax Harbour, opened with a stock of 6,000 bottles of beer, enough to give nearly every sailor 1 bottle to celebrate with. The Navy believed that was surely going to be enough. It was not. At 9 p.m. the bottles were gone, and the canteen was closed. But last call did not mean the party was over. It was just beginning, and the sailors looked towards Halifax as their next destination. At 9:15 p.m., Lieutenant Commander R.W. Wood, Chief of the Navy Shore Patrol, looked out his window towards the Stadacona and saw sailors swarming a streetcar like ants. They were punching out the windows and scaring Halifax residents inside the car. Wood sent 30 of his officers to disperse the sailors while he spoke to Warrant Officer John Barber from City Hall. He quickly discovered that the commotion in front of him was just a small part of what was going on. Barber told him, "The police have given up. There were 4,000 people jamming the streets. They're ripping down flags and having a hell of a time." Meanwhile, the horde made up of 4,000 sailors and growing started to travel down Barrington Street in downtown Halifax, causing mayhem along the way. The city police were able to get all the streetcars into the barns except for the one the troops had surrounded. There was little that the police or the Navy Patrol could do to stop the growing crowd in downtown Halifax. A policy was in place that allowed crowds, which also prevented the arrest of any sailors for public drunkenness. The policy was developed by Rear Admiral Leonard Murray because, according to a later testimony, he wanted to protect the shore patrol from civilians who might take offense to the rough treatment of sailors. Murray said, "Here is a man who helped win the war, and you're going to arrest him for being a little tight on VE Day?" With police and Navy patrol officers unable to do much more than watch, the streetcar was set on fire by the sailors. When firemen arrived, the sailors slashed their hose to ribbons. Then the firefighters attached another hose, so the sailors punched the firefighters, forcing them to flee, and it was all about to get much worse. The problem with an unruly crowd is that as damages increase, so does participation. It's called herd mentality. If there's a large enough group, humans will tend to conform to their behavior. If that group is sitting around singing folk songs, new arrivals will do the same. If that group is blackout drunk and causing mayhem on the street, people who would have never thought of doing the same will get caught up in it and join in. This sort of situation has been covered many times on this show. The Richard Riot, which I covered in early 2024, involved people who opposed the Rocket Richard suspension and smashed up downtown Montreal. The Christie Pitts Riot, which I covered in late 2022, saw 10,000 people take to the streets to cause mayhem after a swastika was flown at a baseball game. Anytime one of Canada's NHL teams advances in the playoffs, there's always a growing worry of carnage and destruction from fans. Vancouver experienced this twice, in 1994 and 2011, when thousands of people caused $4 million in damages. In Edmonton, the Oilers went to the Stanley Cup Final in 2006. And even when the team won, people smashed windows, tipped cars, and tore down street signs to celebrate. The idea of trashing my own city to celebrate the team I love isn't logical to me, but if I was part of that crowd, maybe herd mentality would have taken over for me too. And herd mentality was on full display during the riot on VE Day 1945. Rivers of people flowed into the initial group of 4,000 to 5,000 sailors, and the crowd swelled to 8,000 people. Sailors, citizens, and even some Air Force and Army personnel were all swept up in the carnage, and the long night was just beginning. The rioters in downtown Halifax were an unrelenting wave of destruction, rolling over everything in their path and leaving nothing untouched. If there was a flagpole in their path, they tore it down. If they saw a window, they smashed it. If there was a liquor store, they swarmed inside and took every bottle. A young man, Donald Douglas, wrote a letter home after the riot stating, "The 3 liquor commissions were broken into and the entire contents released to the use of the people. Every store on Barrington Street, the main street, was almost demolished. There wasn't a window left and the contents were either looted or thrown into the street. There were shoes, boots, Chesterfield clothes, cash registers, pots, pans, and nearly everything you could imagine on the street. One liquor store was broken into, so the security guard called police, and when they arrived, the mob threw bricks and stones at them. The police retreated, and the liquor store was liberated of every drop of beer, wine, and hard liquor." The Halifax Herald wrote, "The mob smashed the plate glass windows in the store, rushed in oblivious of the jagged glass edges, and came out with many bottles of liquor amid cheers of onlookers. The mob members brandished the bottles in hilarious joy, some carrying 3 or 4 quarts in their arms. Some intrepid members of the mob deduced that if they could rob a liquor store, they could also pillage the source. A portion of the crowd went to the Alexander Keith Brewery and overpowered the guards, and a steady stream of people carrying boxes of beer out of the brewery began. Within a short time, the brewery was empty. One police officer said the crowd was not drinking beer by the case, they were drinking whiskey by the case. A fire was started at the People's Credit Jewelry store. That fire spread next door to Dillard's Women's Wear store and then Fader's Drug Store. All 3 buildings were destroyed. At 11:30 p.m., a patrol wagon arrived and 50 people seized it, tipped it on its side, and lit it on fire as the officers inside barely escaped with their lives. And by midnight, the crowd downtown had swelled to 12,000 people. Along Barrington Street, it was said there was so much broken glass it covered all the sidewalks and half the road on either side, the Vancouver Sun wrote. It was the same everywhere. Halifax, by early evening, an anything-goes madhouse, where Canadian sailors walked the streets in their underwear under a giant V for Victory canopy of searchlight beams, became by midnight a bedlam of wrecked streetcars, damaged patrol wagons, and ransacked liquor stores. And as May 7th became May 8th, the rioting continued. Destroying a downtown core burns a lot of calories, and the mob was hungry. They turned their attention away from alcohol, they had plenty of that around now, and ransacked stores and shops of every morsel of food. Lucy Van Gogh wrote, Halifax was full of men who had been doing their bit in the war, who had helped finish off the war, and who thought they were entitled to have a day's celebration, complete with food, when it was announced that the war was finished. When they found they could not buy food, it occurred to them that they might as well take it, and they began to do so. As the sun slowly rose on Halifax, on the first day without a world war in 6 years, civilians found no peace. The Montreal Gazette reported, drunken rioters tore through downtown Halifax today and tonight, looting, smashing and burning at least 10 city blocks in the wildest orgy of victory celebrations reported from any city on the entire continent. In his diary, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King called the riot in Halifax a disgraceful affair. King, who did not drink, put all of the blame on alcohol. But Halifax was quiet, but the downtown looked as though a retreating army had come through. All those people, sailors, citizens, and other personnel, were on their way home with stolen items to sleep off a monster hangover. One workman, who started early on repairs, said he counted 800 broken windows and had only just started work. Most store owners boarded up the windows while they waited for repairs, the Halifax Herald reported. The destruction is the worst visited on Halifax since the Great Explosion of 1917, when buildings were flattened and thousands of windows smashed. No buildings were flattened in the Victory Riot, but there is scarcely a window in the city's main business section that has not been smashed. But there was one building that wasn't damaged. It was the barber shop of Jack Sutherland. Not a single window was broken, and that was all thanks to Emma McKay. From the afternoon until the crowd went to bed, for 12 hours, she stood in front of the store where she convinced at least a dozen people not to break a window. To keep some of the sailors out, she fabricated a story to appeal to their hearts. She told them there was a dying girl in the back of the shop and asked the sailors to let her die in peace. Despite being intoxicated, they agreed and moved on to smash up another store. She said the next day, the store has been here for 56 years, and it wasn't even broken in the Halifax explosion of 1917. It was divine protection. Things may have been quiet that morning, but the riot wasn't over. Those who had partied the night before were sleeping off their day of drinking, but soon enough, they would arise to pick up right where they left off. Rear Admiral Leonard Murray had an excellent sleep the night of the riot. He was not awoken by his officers, and he likely had happy dreams about the end of the war. As he sat down for his breakfast, he opened the newspaper and saw what his sailors had been up to the night before: vandalism, arson, violence. And he knew he had to do something about it. Did he gather his severely hungover sailors in a group and scream at them? Did he yell at his officers for not waking him up so he could stop the carnage? No. He blamed the newspapers for inflating the scale of the riot and said any destruction was caused by civilians, not sailors. He estimated, without evidence, that only 200 of his sailors were part of the crowd of 12,000 people who swept like a wave of orcs over the city. Those 200 sailors, he added, were only involved because they were instigated by civilians. Despite the violence of the night before, Halifax was still in the mood to celebrate the end of the war. Around the city, VE Day celebrations began, mostly low-key due to the events of the previous night. City Council and the RCMP held a meeting where they decided if there was a repeat of the night before, a curfew would be enacted. The RCMP also ordered all available officers and personnel to be ready to go to the streets. And then, the sailors woke up. The canteen of the Stadacona opened again, this time with a fresh stock of alcohol, and by 1 p.m., it was out. With no more alcohol on the ships, the sailors made their way ashore to continue the party from the night before. Rear Admiral Murray took no steps at all to stop the 9,500 sailors from partying in Halifax. I've made a lot of dumb decisions in my life. Spiking my hair and getting frosted tips when I was 22 comes to mind. But that pales in comparison to Leonard Murray doing absolutely nothing to stop a repeat of the night before. He said, "If the civilians are allowed downtown to celebrate, why not the Navy?" And again, carnage reigned supreme. Everything that wasn't nailed down was looted, including the mannequins from stores which sailors danced with in the streets. Several sailors abandoned their uniforms completely and danced around completely naked. Much like Ginger Spice decades later, one sailor wore only a Union Jack flag. To protect the liquor stores and Alexander Keith's brewery, police cordoned off areas and stationed extra men to manage the crowd. But amid all the mayhem and revelry, some sailors decided to make amends for the night before. And rather than get drunk for a second day, they assisted the shore patrol and police by holding back crowds at some liquor stores and department stores. Fires broke out, started by partying men and women, and power lines were also cut, sending the city into darkness for over an hour. At 7 p.m., Mayor Alan Butler issued a curfew. He got into a sound truck with Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, who read the proclamation and ordered his sailors to return to their ships. Mayor Butler ordered all citizens to return to their homes, or they would be leaving themselves open to the full extent of the law. And with a curfew in place and a strong police presence now in the downtown core, the riot finally quieted down. By 8 p.m., the streets were cleared, and Mayor Butler told media that the halt to the rioting was successful and any further disorders would be controlled. After 2 days of drunken partying, the catalog of destruction was staggering. 363 people were arrested, 654 businesses were damaged, and 207 were looted. In downtown Halifax, 2,624 sheets of glass had been smashed. From liquor stores and breweries, the mob stole 61,500 liters of liquor, 8,000 cases of beer, and 1,500 cases of wine. A total of $5 million in damages occurred during the rioting, amounting to about $88 million today. The Toronto Star reported that downtown Halifax looked like London after the Blitz, and dozens of people were also injured. Donald Douglas, who had helped gather the wounded in the city, wrote in his letter home to his family that the first person he came across was knocked out with a face slashed to pieces by a broken bottle. He loaded that man, then 3 more on the same trip who were described as just as bad, on their way to the hospital. He wrote, "One had his arm cut at an artery and was nearly gone, and if I hadn't stopped the bleeding, then he wouldn't have lasted much longer. I got one fellow who had a broken bottle shoved in his back and twisted till it made a hole. Folks, there were things that I could hardly look at, but had to." Douglas wrote that by the end of his shift he had handled broken bones, cut gashes, concussions, and everything imaginable. Among the injured, there were also 3 dead men. Vern Trucker collapsed while celebrating and died from alcohol poisoning. Ernest Fitzgerald lost his life for the same reason. Lieutenant Commander George Smith was found dead on the campus of Dalhousie College. Foul play was suspected, but nobody was ever arrested. Even with 2 days of carnage behind them, the Navy did what it could to limit the blame on sailors. Navy Minister Douglas Abbott stated, "Many of the naval ratings who took part in these unfortunate disturbances are the same men who've earned the country's gratitude for their courage and endurance in the long, arduous Atlantic campaign." Leonard Murray echoed this when he once again blamed the citizens of Halifax for encouraging the service personnel to riot. The citizens blame the soldiers blame the citizens. It would take the federal government to get to the bottom of who was truly at fault. On May 9th at 5 p.m., Halifax City Council held an emergency meeting. A resolution was adopted that called for an investigation to find out who was responsible and to gain compensation from the federal government to the tune of $4.5 million. The federal government quickly appointed E.L. Cousins, a part-time port administrator, to oversee a probe. This was not greeted warmly by Halifax residents, who wanted a royal commission into the matter. The Halifax Daily Star wrote, "The people of Halifax have the highest regard for Mr. Cousins in his capacity as port administrator, but in an affair of such magnitude as the outbreaks and disorders of the present week, the circumstances demand that at the very least, a justice of the Supreme Court be placed in full charge of investigations." Hearing the anger of Halifax residents, on May 10th, the federal government ordered a royal commission to investigate what happened, and it would be led by Supreme Court of Canada Justice Roy Kellogg. The riots were over, but the people of Halifax were not going to forget the carnage brought upon them by those who partied in the streets. Catherine Stevens, who was a member of the Women's Royal Navy Service, stated, "I wouldn't want to go through it again. After everything was over, we weren't allowed into some restaurants." Mayor Butler added to this by stating, "I speak the solemn protest of the citizens against the Royal Canadian Navy. It will be long before the people of Halifax forget that great crime." On May 12th, Leonard Murray was removed from his command and replaced with Vice Admiral George Jones. The move angered Murray because he and Jones had been rivals since they were in the same class at the Royal Naval College of Canada. On May 13th, Rear Admiral V.G. Brodeur was appointed to investigate the naval participation in the riot for the Naval Board of Inquiry. The Kellogg Commission released its report first. Kellogg put nearly all of the blame for the riot on Murray and the Navy. Murray was criticized for not exercising better control over the sailors and their celebrations in the city. Justice Kellogg wrote in his report, "The disorders, which actually occurred on May 7th and 8th, owe their origin, in my opinion, to failure on the part of the Naval Command in Halifax to plan for their personnel. Once stated, the development and continuance of the disorders were due to the failure of the Naval Command to put down the initial disorders on each of the days, May 7th and 8th. Murray responded by stating that he was being unfairly blamed with his officers when civilians were at fault. He also criticized the fact that he and his men were not given the opportunity to defend themselves to the Commission. Navy Minister Douglas Abbott defended his friend and stated he hoped that the excellent record of Rear Admiral Murray would not be lost because of the report. Wanting to clear his name, Murray asked for a court-martial trial, but this was denied. The Government of Canada instead issued a press release stating, "It would be a regrettable thing if, resultant upon the Halifax disturbances, the truly great services of this officer and those under his command were to be forgotten by the people of Canada." Rear Admiral Brodeur released his own report soon after the Kellogg report. It also put the blame on Naval Command. It stated, "The disorders of the 7th and 8th of May cannot be attributed to one cause, but rather to a series of events which led a normal body of men, prepared to celebrate in an innocuous manner, to disorders of a serious nature. Once started, the development and continuance of the disorders were due to the failure of the Naval Command to put down the initial disorders on each of the 2 days." By September 1945, Murray was still waiting to get a new command, but this was not coming. On September 6, 1945, he received a letter from the government stating that, due to recent developments, there was no suitable appointment for him to be employed in. Murray, a man who had helped defend Canada and the United Kingdom during the Battle of the Atlantic, saw this as a slap in the face, and rather than challenge the decision, he chose to leave the Navy completely. He said, "I thought it best to withdraw quietly, for the good of the service. I went into voluntary exile." By the end of the month, Murray left Canada for England. Halifax continued to pick up the pieces as summer turned to autumn. The federal government announced it would provide $1 million in compensation to businesses that had suffered in the riot. Nearly 20% of that amount went to the Nova Scotia Liquor Commission to cover their losses. By October 4th, 12 of 16 men who had been given jail sentences for participation in the riot were released after a review of their sentences by the Justice Department. They were released by Justice Minister Louis Saint Laurent on the recommendation of John Diefenbaker for clemency. Both men would actually go on to serve as Prime Minister of Canada. Those released were 3 members of the Navy, 2 from the Merchant Navy, 4 from the Army, and 3 civilians. According to Minister Saint Laurent, the offenses arising from the riots had been on a special basis. Not everyone was so lucky, though. One petty officer from Regina did receive 5 years in prison for stealing, while another from Saskatoon got 3 years. So that is the story of the Halifax riot, a time when a lot of people partied hard. But what happened to the man who took the most of the blame? Rear Admiral Leonard Murray. The man who was blamed for the Halifax riot settled initially in Sussex. In his retirement, he qualified as a lawyer and worked in maritime law. He served on school boards and various village councils as well. His love of the sea never left him, though, and he became a member of the Bar Yacht Club, where he was a racing captain for a decade. He also helped lead the local Sea Scouts for years. In 1960, he left law to care for his wife, who died 2 years later. He remarried in 1963 to a surgeon named Antonina after meeting her on a Greek cruise. As he aged, he spoke out against changes in the Canadian military, specifically the unification of the Canadian Armed Forces in 1968. and Murray never forgave the government for his treatment after the Halifax riot. Despite this, he did return home on occasion. His last visit was in 1970 when he unveiled a Battle of the Atlantic stained glass window at the chapel at CFB Halifax. That was the last time he saw his homeland. He died peacefully in his sleep on November 25, 1971. His ashes were placed at St. Paul's Church in Halifax. Back home in Canada, his death made the inside pages of newspapers, and only a few blurbs were devoted to his life story. But since his death, Murray has become remembered more for his years of service to Canada and the Navy, rather than the riot. The Canadian Naval Operations School building at CFB Halifax was named for him in 1985, and exhibits honor him at the Juno Beach Centre and Canadian War Museum. In 1977, he was designated as a National Historic Person. And perhaps in the greatest honor of them all, a character was created for him in the online game World of Warships Legends. Well, maybe not the greatest honor, but still pretty cool. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Halifax riot. Information from Canadian Encyclopedia, For Posterity's Sake, the Canadian War Museum, Halifax.ca, Canadian Military Magazine, Wikipedia, CTV News, Maclean's, and Legion Magazine. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.